In this next chapter of BUMWIPER, I'm going to talk about things that I've never really spoken about out loud. I'm not 100% sure how I'm going to get through this, but I want to try. So let's dive in and see what happens. Welcome to Mark My Words. Mark My Words is the story of my journey from a place where I was shattered to where I could live again. Okay, this is BUMWIPER, the beginning of the end. I guess it's chapter 8 as far as we've been reading, but let's dive in, see what happened. My tragic departure from the disability world started with a single phone call. My boss, who had never called me before unless there was a major problem or I was being promoted, started well enough. I had just been put on a list of people who were eligible to become network managers, and I assumed that this call was to offer me the job. It wasn't. My worst fears came true in a blinding shock. I had been accused of abusing a client. As the senior staff member in the house, I was prepared for anything, I thought. My heart sinking, but with anger rising, I asked who I was supposed to have abused. I was told that the female client had presented with bruises and accused me of causing them. I asked when she'd made this accusation, as I had just spent a lovely afternoon with her at the shops. I was then told that she had not made the accusation herself, but a staff member had. I asked which staff member and was told that the information was confidential. I asked when I had supposedly committed the assault. I was told that it allegedly happened 2 times. Once, 18 months before, the second time, 12 months before. Let me emphasize here that the supposed assaults had happened 12 and 18 months before. Why in hell did the staff member wait so long to make the accusation? I was never to find out. This would be a question that would haunt me for the next 6 months. Who had accused me of such a despicable act? I asked if the client had made the complaint about me at all and was answered that no, she hadn't made any complaint. It was purely from the staff member. Even now, this is hard to write as the wound is still very raw. I asked what the next step was and was told that I needed to leave the unit immediately and I was not to discuss the matter with anyone. I'd be contacted at a later stage when someone would interview me about the incident. I was furious. I was livid. To have an unsubstantiated claim made against me by one of my colleagues was unfathomable. I had no way of dealing with the fact that I had been betrayed by somebody that I worked with and potentially trusted. I was told that I was to be placed immediately on leave and that I was to report to the head office the next day. It's difficult to explain the psychological impact this had on me because at the time it didn't register that it was having any psychological impact. I did not realize, but I was very burnt out by this stage. I'd been doing the job for a long time and I'd internally become cold, and I certainly wasn't myself. So the next day I reported to the office. The accusation was outlined for me and I was able to ask questions about who made the accusation. He can't tell me. Why didn't they report this sooner? We can't tell you. How can somebody wait 12 months and then 18 months to make an accusation? What has happened to make a person feel like reporting this 12 months after the fact? Why did they wait so long to make the accusation? It's truly difficult to express how much this hurt. I had, in effect, given my life to working with people with disabilities. Shift work is tough. It's not easy. To have to miss so much of regular life because you're doing shift work when I was young didn't really matter to me. Here I was married, though, and I had a kid, and I wasn't there every second weekend. I wasn't there after the evenings most of the week because I was at work. My whole life, everything that I was centered around what I did and how what I was doing had a positive effect on the world. I felt like I was making a difference. When that betrayal came, what was left of my mental health started to deteriorate. A few weeks after the accusation was made, I had a panic attack. I didn't know what was going on. I was walking through the mall, and all of a sudden, I didn't know where I was going, or how I got there. Started not being able to breathe. I found I was walking up and down in a little kind of circle. I thought I was dying. Somehow, I pulled myself together enough to get myself home. I went to see the GP the next day, and he told me that I was suffering from depression and anxiety and gave me some pills. He told me I'd be fine. Now it was time to go through this entire investigation. Not knowing anything about when the investigation was going to be over, I didn't know at what stage the investigation was. I didn't know who was being interviewed about the allegation. I didn't even know if the client, the female resident, actually corroborated the accusation. I did not know anything. My bosses clearly did not believe the accusation. I think in many ways they were as frustrated as I was because I was racking my brain. I was trying to figure out who would have made such a horrible allegation. Now, this client was actually known for making false accusation. She'd accused people of molesting her. She'd even accused female staff of members of molesting her. She had accused other staff members of punching her, none of which was true. She was a dual diagnosis client. She had an intellectual disability. She also had other health issues. I think she may have been bipolar. I can't remember, and it hurts too much for me to go back into the research to try and figure that out. This time was agony for me. But during it, my bosses gave me a job. I had to archive every document in the entire department that the government department had. Boxes and boxes of documentation going back 10 or 15 years that had never been archived. So I went to each group house, grabbed all their old document and archived them. I had to categorize them and I had to sort them out. Had to put them in some kind of order and then send them off to the archives before they could be destroyed after a certain amount of time. Unfortunately, I was very good at this job. It was mindless and it was easy. I finished that boss, and my boss said to me, "Well, look, we've got this manager position at another house. Why don't we put you in there?" I said, "Okay, I'll do it." But then they told me I could never be alone with a client. I had no idea how I was supposed to go to work and not interact with clients. It's like when you work in a shop, but they say to you, "I'll go to work, just don't sell anything." It just didn't make sense. This was nonsensical to me. And when I had another panic attack when I was left in a room with one of those clients, nonsensical as this is, I went on to have another panic attack when I was left in a room with one of the clients. Now, this is something I had done thousands of times, but I had started to doubt myself, started to fear being in that room, started to be anxious. I went back to the doctor the next day and was put on stress leave. Now, in the end, I was completely exonerated of this accusation. They tried to tell me that there wasn't enough evidence, so they couldn't move forward with the accusation. When I asked them what evidence they did uncover, they admitted that they uncovered no evidence. The client didn't corroborate the accusation. And I was supposed to go back and manage the house. This house where one of my staff had utterly portrayed me as an abuser. I asked in my interview over and over again who it was that accused me of this horrible thing. I desperately wanted to know, but I was told that they couldn't tell me because the person had said that they were afraid of me. They were afraid that I would physically hurt them. Not one of my colleagues had any reason to fear me. I was not a muscle-bound bloke, and I didn't get into into fights. In fact, I was known for being extremely calm. In the interview, I said that it looked like a staff member can make up any lie that they want about me and then say that they're afraid of me, and I never get to find out who it was that made the accusation. How am I supposed to go back to a team where someone has made such a horrible accusation and with such a bizarre time frame? I asked why the staff member waited so long. I asked if they were going to be disciplined for either, first off, making up the accusation, or second, not doing their due diligence or their duty of care. Reporting the incident when it first happened is critical in this job. Now, if you turned around and said this week a client presented with bruises and said that somebody assaulted them, it is my duty of care and my due diligence to report that immediately. Didn't make sense to me that 12 months ago, 18 months ago, an incident supposedly happened with no evidence, and my life could be turned completely upside down. Even now, as I'm writing this, I have to squash the anger that I have over this. As I said, at the end of the process, I was left exonerated. I was told that there was no evidence that I committed the assault, nor did the client corroborate the accusation. All that was left for me was to go back to work. Now, I'd spent most of the last 5 months on stress leave or sitting in small rooms sorting files. During this time, I felt like I was going more and more crazy. I was hurt and confused and barely in my right mind. The decisions that were made for me next by my bosses have consequences that I still live with today. Once I was exonerated, I was told by my superiors that they never really believed the accusation. One boss told me that they thought it was spurious and designed to hurt me. I asked how I was supposed to go back into a house with the person who had essentially stabbed me in the back. As I mentioned, I was waiting for a position as a network manager. But before that opened up, they thought it would be a good idea for me to go into a house with clients who were incredibly violent. This was a house that had gone through 8 staff members, people who had been injured at work and were no longer able to work in that house or even in the industry. There was clearly something very wrong with the unit and the way that it was being run. The behaviors of the clients were out of control. It was thought that because I had just had a quote 6-month break, unquote, it would be a good idea for me to go into the house to fix these problems. In essence, this meant that I was to go into a house that was full of violence, diagnose the issues, and then implement strategies for the staff that they could use to manage the negative behavior. Clearly, this was something that I should not have said yes to. But at the time, I was still of the mindset that I was unbreakable. Nothing in my career, not any of the violent situations I'd found myself in, had broken me. I was still on my feet, so I thought I was ready for this new challenge. Quite simply, I was deceiving myself. The issue started when I first walked into the house. There was a particular client who I'd worked with before who needed a complex and comprehensive behavioral intervention strategy in order for him to remain calm and not display negative, see violent, behaviors. For instance, this client loved to cook. He absolutely loved it. It was an activity that he enjoyed and got a lot out of it, not least of which is the fact that everybody got something yummy to eat when he'd finished. This was an activity that we had promoted in the previous unit that he lived in and was a valuable part of his growth, independence, and self esteem. But let's be clear, it could also be very, very, very dangerous. Whenever we conduct an activity with a client, we need to run a risk assessment. Now, let's talk about the risks that are inherent in the kitchen. These are things that anyone with a small child will be very familiar with. In the kitchen, there is fire or heat. In short, there's things that can burn you. Or in this instance, things that an angry person can use to burn you. Being nudged with a hot pan, being doused in boiling water from a pot, or something simply just catching fire. The second danger in the minefield that is the kitchen is anything sharp. Anything sharp or pointy or in any way able to cut a person should be seen firstly as a hazard, but also as a potential weapon in someone else's hands. So for this client, the plan when cooking was that he needed to be supported at all times. He needed to be positioned in such a way that the staff member couldn't be trapped, and his access to heat and pointy things was extremely limited. The biggest thing that was when you were done, you had to put the knives away. More specifically, you had to lock them away so you can't access them without your position. In this new house, not only was this management plan not in place, when I asked the staff members about it, they didn't even know it existed. In short, the turnover of the house was so great that the staff currently working with the clients did not know their histories, their risk factors, or the management plans necessary to be used when working with those clients. To build a management plan for a client is a massive undertaking. It can take months, even years at times, to put in place. You need to develop the plan. It needs to be circulated to the rest of the staff for comment. The plan then needs to go to various doctors and specialists to ensure that it's appropriate and necessary to implement. The specialists will also have input that needs to be factored into the plan. If there is an advocate or if the parents are very much involved, they need to see the planning in action and then provide input and advice and ultimately approve the plan for use by the staff. This process had been undertaken for the 5 clients in the house, but because the staff turnover had been so high through accident and injury, these plans were locked in a drawer and forgotten about. The first incident of violence that I saw happen on my very first day. Staff member had cooked dinner for everyone at the unit and had served up that food onto plates on the bench. Now, if the management plan had been in place and I had been able to read it, I would have understood that one of the clients in the house had taken it upon himself to assist us by putting the food on the table for everyone to enjoy. This was his quote unquote job. I did not know this, so I took the food and put it on the table. The client started screaming and he grabbed all of the plates and threw them at the ceiling, food and all. One of the plates, thankfully plastic, hit me and the other clients. This entire critical incident was entirely avoidable and should never have happened. This gives you an example of the behavioral plans that I needed to re-establish and put back in place. Something as simple as serving dinner, unless it was done the way this client needed it to be done, became an unnecessarily dangerous situation. I mentioned before the client with the cooking program. Before I started my next shift, he had been cooking with another staff member. Unbeknownst to me, while I knew that the client had been cooking, I was unaware that the very simple step of locking away the sharp knives after cooking was completed had not been done. All of the knives, including the ones who had stabbed me with, were left unattended in the kitchen. I did a handover with the previous staff member and proceeded to walk into the main part of the house. This is something I had done thousands of times in hundreds of places. I was beginning my shift and basically getting the lay of the land. I knew that I was alone with one client, and I also assumed that I would be walking into a place of safety, one where I knew the client had no access to weapons of any sort and who was calmly amusing himself before his housemates got home. The house that we were in was a temporary house. The clients had, for all intents and purposes, destroyed the previous house, and it was being completely renovated. Double glazed security glass was put in all the windows. Heavy wood used on the walls instead of the flimsy stuff they normally use. And all of the appliances and things that make a home functional were securely bolted down and made safe for staff to work with the clients. Even the television set was being encased. It would be in a Perspex cabinet because one of the clients had used the old TV to hit a staff member. The temporary house they were in had none of these built-in safety measures. In fact, as I was to find out shortly later on this particular afternoon, it was downright dangerous. We also had a number of other so-called safety measures in place. The staff office in the area that used to be the garage was separated from the main house. The door separating the two rooms had two large bolts on it. That way, it was able to be used for extra security should staff have to retreat from the violence in the main part of the house. In theory, this was an excellent idea and something I would have insisted on if it hadn't been in place. The problem was that the bolts had been attached to a standard door, a flimsy piece of plywood with cardboard as the filler inside. This was to have a direct impact on me just a few minutes later. The second security measure was a handy button that we could wear around our neck, which was attached to a cord. This was a button that would sound an alarm in another place, staffed with people who could call you to see if you needed assistance. This was a panic button. Staff in the house had stopped wearing the panic button because they kept accidentally pressing it and having to deal with the security company, which cost us every time they did it. To them, it was seen as an unnecessary hindrance that served no purpose. I was wearing the panic button as I began my shift. I took one step into the main part of the house when something hit me on the forehead between my eyes. I reeled back, unsure what hit me, but I realized I was instantly in trouble. I can't tell you what the client was saying, whether they were screaming, or even if they were saying anything at all. I just knew that they wanted to hurt me, perhaps even killed me. I stepped back into the office and somehow closed the door against the charging client. Now, if the door had been made of solid wood, I would have been safe. The incidents, for all intents and purposes, would be over. I had pressed the panic button, so I was expecting to get a call in the next 30 seconds that would inquire as to the nature of the emergency, and in this case, the police would be dispatched. There were a number of things that went wrong on this day that were purely due to circumstance. This particular day was the day when the horse race known as the Melbourne Cup was run. By a bizarre coincidence, the client had attacked me just as the horses were leaving the gate. In Australia, the Melbourne Cup race is known as the race that stops the nation. I always thought that this statement was figurative or hyperbole. I was to find out that it literally stopped the most important parts of the nation that I needed at that moment, which was the security company and the police. When my emergency call had been made by the panic button, someone, whoever was supposed to be on the end of the line, was watching a stupid horse race. I was in the fight of my life and desperately needed help, but there was no one to help me. It was at this moment that the so-called security door came crashing around me. I was leaning with my back against the door trying to get my bearings when the client simply bashed through to where I was. Now, a lot happened from this point up until the point that I found myself sitting in the gutter with a policeman asking me what happened. I was covered in scratches. Thankfully, I had not been seriously wounded or stabbed. I had minor scratches from the broken door and other wounds. Given what has happened in my life since then, I have at times wished that the client had cut my face or my arms somewhere a person could see, because then I would have proof of my mental illness. I would be able to point out these scars and say, here is my PTSD. Somehow, with the door crashing down around me, I managed to pick up the house phone. This was in the days before smartphones, so it was a landline. I called 000 asking for help. Here was another issue for me because I sounded so calm in reporting the incident that the person taking the call did not send it through to the patrol officers as an emergency or critical incident. I had trained myself so well to communicate clearly in a critical incident that when I was telling the person that there had been an attack in the house, apparently I did it in such a way that they didn't believe it was an emergency. I can recall being outside the house after having had to evacuate the safe room as the client had smashed through the door. There was only a glass door between me and my assailant. They were on the other side of the glass, pulling at the door, screaming at me, showing me the knife. As I couldn't lock the door, I was using my hands to hold the door closed. Somehow I was strong enough to stop this person getting through the glass door. At some point, and for some reason that I don't quite understand, he calmed down. Now, I'd been speaking to him speaking to him nonstop throughout the incident, and it's possible that at this stage I said something that was able to calm him down. I had the phone in my hand and I was able to call my boss and tell them what happened. Then I sat down in the gutter. Finally, a single police car approached. Their lights were on, but their siren was not. When they saw me in the gutter, covered in my own blood, they quickly realized that they had not been prepared properly for the situation. They thought they had shown up at a drunken domestic, not the scene of a horrific knife attack. They jumped on the radio and said something, some code. Can't remember what it was, but I do know that within a few moments, I heard a lot more sirens coming from a lot more places. The street that I was in was a cul-de-sac and was slowly filling with about a dozen police cars. The first officers that showed up and attended to me then raced inside the house to assess the situation and apprehend the assailant. These two cops were amazing. One of them sat down with me in the gutter and asked me what had happened. I went through the story and then he disappeared. This was about the time that the other police cars started showing up. This was also the time that I realized that all of these officers had been at Melbourne Cup Day functions watching a stupid horse race. I knew this because the senior officers were wearing their dress uniforms with their medals and all their braid. These people absolutely dropped the ball from this moment on. I was asked by one of these braided people whether I wanted to press charges. He told me that it was not going to do anything because the client had an intellectual disability and would never be charged in court. In effect, he was telling me that the man who had just tried to kill me could not and would not be convicted. Normally, in the past, I would never have thought to have the man charged. But on this day, something inside me was very different. I didn't know what, but I knew that something inside me had changed. It was now that the men in braid would make a series of decisions that to this day I cannot comprehend. They realized that my assailant had an intellectual disability and had difficulty in communicating. They called me up to the house and asked me to communicate with this man that he was being taken to the police station. It was made very clear to me that they could see no reason why I would do this because it wouldn't lead anywhere. My boss had finally shown up by this time and said, "Mark, you can do it if you want to." Went up to the man's room and I knew he was surrounded by. I went up to the man's room at the police officer's request where I knew he was surrounded by police officers. I realized he would need to have shoes and socks on to go to the station. One of the staff members came to me and said, "You need to help him put his shoes and socks down." I knelt in front of my attacker, covered in the blood that came from the wounds that he had inflicted, and had to tie his shoes. Worse, he was not in handcuffs, and the cops were in the hallway, not in the room. I look back at this honestly flabbergasted that the cops had allowed me to do this. I then had to help the man put a jumper on. One of the braided officers asked me to help get the client to the police car while he was still uncuffed. When we got to the paddy wagon, the client was nervous about climbing in the back. There were no seat belts, and of course he'd have to be locked in. Mr. Braid then suggested I climb into the back of the paddy wagon with the client, so I did. So here I am on the way to the police station in the back of the paddy wagon, sitting next to and supporting physically my intellectually disabled client while I was still covered in my own blood. We got to the station and the client had to go into the cells. I was once again asked to assist, so I did. Once he was in the cell, he asked for a glass of water. The cop that I was with said, "Sure, Mark, you can get him a glass of water." It was at this point that I did something that I'd never done before in my working career. I said no to a client for my own personal and selfish reasons. I could not know that my last decision, made while working with the client, would be a decision that I should have made hundreds of times before this. I said no. I remember telling clients no when it came to things like, "Can I stay up late?" I've not had my medication and stuff like that, but it never once in my career made a decision to deny a client for a reason that was for my own sanity and preferences. Here it was that I made another of my mistakes, if you can call it that. I sounded so calm throughout this whole interaction that the cops assumed that I was perfectly fine. I was not being myself. I was not telling jokes, but to them, I was composed and completely unaffected. After being interviewed and photographed, I walked out of that police station, walked to the gutter, sat down, and started crying. I was crying uncontrollably and I could not stop. I simply just could not stop. What was unusual about this is that I did not cry. I did not ever cry for no reason. In the olden days, when I was brought up, it was okay to cry, but only if you had a legitimate reason. Like when somebody you love passes away or you lose your arm in a tractor accident. But to cry for no reason was next to unfathomable. In that moment, I hated myself. I hated the fact that I couldn't stop myself from crying. What the police had seen was not a man who was composed and under control. What they should have seen was a man in shock, intense shock. I couldn't know it at the moment, but I was now living with complex PTSD. I wouldn't know this for a number of weeks, and in those weeks, I learned to hate myself more and more. Along with the tears came the anxiety. And I'm not talking about being anxious like waiting for Christmas. I'm talking about full on fear that someone is about to attack and kill me. To be startled to the point where your body shakes, you have trouble breathing and you can't think clearly. To be living in a heightened state of fear, expecting at any moment for my life to be in danger, became my existence. Added to these symptoms was the depression, a depression that felt like an extremely deep hole, the walls of which got smaller and smaller the deeper you went. I was filled with that feeling of desperate sadness combined with the feeling of constriction, a physical feeling that I was being crushed. These emotions were ones that I had not felt in this intensity before. I'd experienced I'd experienced glimmers of these mental illness symptoms, but they now reached a level that I did not know could exist. Think of it as your body doing things that you can't understand. For me, it was crying. But then I was full of anxiety. My fight or flight instincts were kicking off so often that I learned to fear those panic attacks as much as I feared for my own life. In short, I became afraid of the way my body would react to nothing at all. It is difficult, even now, to express how much I detested myself in these moments. I felt that I had become someone or something that I hated. I thought I had become I thought I'd become weak, hopeless, and pathetic. I hated myself that I wouldn't even look at myself in the mirror. I didn't quite realize this until one day I glanced in the mirror and found a grey hair in my beard. Ran out to my wife, half amazed, half excited, mostly amused to tell her. She looked at me like I was a crazy person. She said that I'd had in grey in my beard for at least a couple of years. It was then that I realized that I wouldn't even look myself in the face in the mirror. To compound these my feelings of failure, a couple of days later I got a call from my boss. Son of a bitch asked me when I was coming back to work. I told him that I didn't know. I was in no state to even consider going back to work. I was barely functioning as a human being at this time. What I needed was understanding and patience. All my boss did was tell me that I needed to get back on the horse and get back to work. You see, my leaving the unit, or at least not being at the unit, was making his life very hard. The man that had been handpicked to come in and fix this dangerous house that was harming so many staff members had also become a victim. It was about this time that I contacted my union, and they suggested that we go and see some lawyers. Clearly, my workplace had let me down in many, many ways. I went to the lawyers and they told me that due to a change made in the New South Wales government legal system, I was unable to sue for negligence. There would be no way for me to get anything more than the standard workers' compensation that came after any injury in the workplace. I would not receive a lump sum payment, and the workers' comp decreased the amount that was paid to me every 6 months. I was unable to work in my chosen career. I was damaged emotionally and mentally, almost beyond repair, and I would receive nothing. I have an article that I found from about this time. There was a teacher in Victoria who had just received a $750,000 payment as a compensation. The details of this article outlined the incident in question. A student in his classroom had threatened to stab him with a knife. The kid had put his hand under the desk and said, "I have a knife and I'm going to kill you." There was no evidence that the kid ever had a knife in his possession. The teacher did not see the knife. The teacher was not attacked. There was no attack. There was only the threat. And the teacher got $750,000, $750,000. I saw the knife. The knife, or the back of it at least, hit me in the forehead. I had to hold close sliding glass doors with the client holding the knife, bashing it and himself against the other side of that glass door. I got nothing. Oh, this is tougher than I thought. I have to go. I'll speak to you next week. Yeah, bye for now. Thank you for listening to Mark My Words. I'd like to thank my producer, Meredith Brosnan, and also Torian, Kevin, and Lorraine. And I can't forget the band Adelaide, who allows us to use their song as our theme.